All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on shaping the future of cities, infrastructure, and urban services. The session is part of the platform series here at the Forum. It is very related to what is happening with the Global Future Council on Cities. That's been, working on this topic across the year under the leadership of Alice Charles, with the forum and with all the participants. A couple of practical things. First of all, the session is live streamed, and also for those of for the people who are following and looking at us from elsewhere. And if you want to tweet or use social media, the handle is #UF20. Now, having said that, we got an amazing lineup of participants here for the discussion. I will ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll have a quick fire starter. But João, Governor Doria.
Carlo, thank you very much. That's a pleasure to be here. I'm Governor of São Paulo State, the largest and the most important economic region in Brazil. I'm former mayor of São Paulo City, and since last January, governor of São Paulo. São Paulo grew 2.6%, the national, twice the national average. This was very important for us because we are looking for foreign investments.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Marie Lamfranto. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Infrastructure Hub, so as we call it GIH. So the GIH is a G20 entity, which has been created in 2014 to help the G20 to develop and implement their infrastructure agenda. So obviously for the last couple of years, infrastructure has been very high on the G20 agenda and is a recurrent theme, which is a good thing because there are still a lot of things that needs to be done. So our role, as I mentioned, is really to support them in collecting best practices, also advocating for the right policies, and also do capacity building, specifically focusing on G20 countries.
Thank you. Christian.
Hello, my name is Christian Ulbrich. I'm leading JLA, a global real estate services company listed in the US with a workforce of close to 100,000 people. We are providing cradle-to-grave services in real estate. And we established a sustainability practice more than a decade ago. And so this topic is very close to our hearts.
Great. Angel, why don't you introduce yourself, and then can start with a fire starter.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Angel Xu. I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies at Yale and US College in Singapore. I also direct a lab called the Data-Driven Environmental Lab, and we intersect data science with environmental policy questions, primarily at the intersection of climate change and cities. So thanks so much, Carlo, for the introduction. And today I'll be using the EarthTime platform, which was developed by Carnegie Mellon University's Create Lab, and it allows users to interact with visualizations of the Earth over time. So if we start with the first visualization, the model that you see behind me tracks urban heat across Singapore in a typical day. The shaded areas correspond to temperature, and you can see that these spikes track major sources of urban heat, such as buildings and transportation. And so the most affected areas happen when commuters are traveling from residential areas to the downtown core. This is a central business district here in Singapore. And you can see that they stand in direct contrast to these lighter blue areas, which are much cooler. They tend to be less densely populated, less concentration of buildings and infrastructure. And scientists have shown that this temperature differential between the red and the blue areas can be as high as 7 degrees Celsius. That really makes a huge difference when you talk about a country that sits at the equator. The average temperature there is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 32 degrees Celsius. So what researchers are doing is that they're teaming up with the government in this Cooling Singapore task force, and they're using this data and this high-resolution model to target locally specific solutions to map vulnerability and hotspots to climate change, and to figure out how to tailor traffic flow patterns, for example, or to implement policy interventions such as white roofs, reflective pavements, green roofs, and more vegetation in order to combat climate change. So tools like this could be the future of urban management. Cities are already confronting the climate change crisis. If you look at this next visualization of heat wave risk, in 2050, under just a moderate warming scenario, we can see that high temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius could be the new normal in more than 1,000 cities across the world. That's about triple the current number of cities that face those summertime highs today. Cities are also at a greater risk of sea level rise. If we look at this visualization here, 90% of cities are located along urban areas across the world. This makes them more vulnerable to rising seas and more powerful and frequent storm surges. Scientists predict that by the end of the century, cities may experience on average a foot additional sea level rise above 2000 levels. If we zoom into Shanghai, for example, under a 4 degrees Celsius warming scenario, just to give you a sense, that's where we're headed, given the lack of current policies to address climate change. The city of Shanghai and its 24 million residents virtually disappear from this map. But the irony is that not only are cities affected by climate change, they're also the ones causing it. Cities consume 80% of global energy resources and generate more than 75% of CO2 emissions. In this map here of fossil fuel-based CO2 emissions, you can see these hot spots of carbon dioxide emissions in blue and in yellow overwhelmingly correspond to urban areas. So this energy consumption, production of carbon emissions, the concentration of buildings, infrastructure, trap excess heat, they intensify climate change and lead to these increased chances of heat waves, rising sea levels, and the associated health impacts. So we can see that the imperative for cities to act on climate change is very clear. And whether or not the world meets its sustainable development goals by 2030 will in large part be determined by cities. And so the question is for our panel today, how do cities move forward? What's the solution? Well, I'd like to offer 2 points for consideration today. The first, if cities just get infrastructure right, I really think that they can address climate change head on. Currently, cities act as nodes in global infrastructure and other types of supply chains, such as energy and transportation and electricity networks. And you can see that from this map of how interconnected cities are through these networks that are primarily fossil fuel based. With 60% of the urban land that has yet to be developed by 2030, there's a short window for cities to get this infrastructure right. And so by investing in climate smart infrastructure, what I like to argue is that cities can actually help to avoid locking us into dangerous carbon polluting pathways into the future. And if we look at this next visualization, we can see that the stakes could not be more critical at this time. Most of the urban population growth that has happened over the last 25 years that's been measured by satellite nighttime lights in red have occurred in coastal Africa and also in Southeast Asia. And the projected future growth of cities and urban population by 2050 will also happen in these areas. As you can see from the expanding bubbles, the bubbles are getting bigger in South Asia, India, China, and also in Africa. And this is where governments also have the fewest financial per capita resources to invest in infrastructure, which is anticipated to increase from about 3.4 trillion US dollars a year to $6 trillion a year. And so if cities are able to actually invest in more climate ready and climate resilient infrastructure, I think they can actually help to lower some of these infrastructure costs. And we can already see from this visualization that the global increase in wind energy over the last 25 years has really taken root across many areas and cities in Europe and North America, and increasingly in South and East Asia. And so about thousands of cities now are committing to renewable electricity generation. 250 cities have actually committed to 100% renewable electricity generation. In many of these countries, cities have found that it's actually cheaper to invest in renewable electricity generation than it is in fossil fuel-based resources. And it also creates local job opportunities, helps to secure energy, and also prevents against dangerous air pollution and other health-related effects. So this is one solution. The second solution I'd like to propose is in data innovation. Innovation, data, and modeling can help to allow cities to take advantage of advances in digital technology. We can see in this visualization the growth of 5G networks all across the world. Already there are more than 50 commercially viable 5G network deployments in 27 countries. This number is expected to grow to 328 operators across 109 countries. The number of IoT connected devices is anticipated to grow from 2 billion in 2006 to 200 billion by the end of this year. They're expected to generate 847 zettabytes of data. To give you a sense of what a zettabyte is, because I didn't know before this presentation, if one gigabyte of data were equivalent to drinking an 11-ounce cup of coffee, then a zettabyte would be equivalent to drinking an entire Great Wall's worth of China of data. So it's a huge amount of data that has vast potential to help cities innovate and to make smart cities a reality. Private sector companies like Google are also teaming up with nonprofits to leverage unique insights from their data. And so here, the Google Environmental Insights Explorer is using traffic pattern, activity data, data on air quality to help more than 100 cities across the world develop carbon emissions inventories, particularly for cities in the global south where they may lack financial resources and capacity to develop these inventories. This could be really hugely transformative. My group as well, we're using satellite data and crowdsourced data from OpenStreetMaps to measure how cities across the world are performing on environmental issues like access to green space and tree cover, and how that intersects with social inclusion, equity, and income. And so this was a very quick overview to set the scene for our discussion today, but I believe that if cities are able to get infrastructure right, aided by data and innovation, then we can hope to correct course and have some chance of addressing climate change and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in the next decade. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Angel. Thank you. And so there's no doubt, as you said, that with 75 to 80% of CO2 emissions happening in cities, that's where the battle is going to be fought. So that's where I wanted to ask, each of you to chime in. And Christian, maybe starting from you, how is this, and in particular, the opportunities we saw just a moment ago about data, how data can help us, better manage some of these flows. How is this impacting your business and more generally real estate?
Well, I think we are at early stages where people start to realize how climate is really impacting the future of cities. I think there's a full agreement that, as Angel said, cities will be kind of the decisive factor whether we can move around on that whole topic and reduce the carbon footprint very quickly, because that's where most of the emissions are happening. It hasn't impacted the real estate footprint so far very much. We see kind of little pockets where construction is kind of considering to build new properties or new areas which are kind of climate proof against whatever is happening. We have a development at the moment going on in Tampa where we advise a developer, and everything there is kind of future proof. And so you elevate all the critical technology in the building to an upper floor, so if there is any flooding, then that it is not impacted. It is obviously resilient against any damage from hurricanes and those type of things. The flip side of that is, because it already points to one direction, is all that impact from climate change correlates very much with the wealth. And so if you have enough money, you can deal with that impact and you can do something about it. If you don't have enough money, then it will be difficult. And I think that is something we have to figure out.
That's great. So basically, the funding, how do we manage with this transition? And so now, Mary, how do you see this?
Yeah, I would like to have a go at the question that Angel outlined about how do we finance all of this infrastructure and climate resilient infrastructure to support the development of cities. So as part of our monitoring work for the G20, we publish every year a report called the Infrastructure Outlook. And that's basically looking at what is the infrastructure financing gap. So not surprisingly, it's a very big gap. So currently we've got, we'll talk about the need, the gap is 15 trillion, but the need is 24 trillion US dollar. And a big chunk of it is actually really attached to cities, because we know that this is where infrastructure of tomorrow will be primarily focusing on. So obviously, we know we'll need more privately financed infrastructure. Despite numbers shows that across the world, at best and at peak time, 20%, I would say in few developed countries, was actually in a number, the percentage of projects that were privately financed. So there is still a lot of these projects that will remain on public balance sheet. So indeed, more private financing is necessary, and at the same time, we have a bit of a crisis of a public-private partnership model, because I think we all now have realized, even in developed countries, that too often this is not actually a true partnership, that it's actually very conflictual between the contractors, the financier, and the public sector. So I think there is really now a time to look into creating the real partnership at the base of that. And that will really start by having early discussions on the basis of risk. And how do you actually identify risk associated to specific projects? How do you allocate risk? And then when you have actually looked into those two things, you could get into how do you mitigate the risk and how do you price this risk properly? On that note, and we have had discussion through the infrastructure governors, and I see some of my colleagues from the stewards group of infrastructure also, where we indeed look in detail at how this risk should be better allocated. So the Hub also published a very long report. It's really for practitioner. It's actually not a report, it's a tool to help public sector to understand and to identify risk across, I think we have 18 sectors. And then we look at all sorts of projects. It could be gas pipeline or wastewater treatment, and then really looking at projects. We've actually worked and reviewed 500 projects. Looking through all of these projects, we identify which risks are usually associated to specific projects and which party is the best able to manage it. So I think the first point is that. And then the second point is really, again, in this spirit of dialogue and creating this partnership, is really what we call collaborative contracting. So we were discussing this morning that a lot of the issue that we have currently is the lack of development capital. So across Asia and Africa, where most of the city will actually emerge from, the money that has been committed from the multilateral development banks is 4.2 billion. If you think that in total, you need for this project preparation money is 10% more or less of the capex. It's only 40 billion, which is actually available. And if you remember the gap that I've just mentioned of 15 trillion global, even this 40 billion in Africa and Asia will not be sufficient. So it's very important that then, this development capital is really put forward. And that has a lot to do with how you procure the infrastructure. How do you ensure that you could create collaborative contracting that allow developers to work at early stage and being able to get to the tender and have a much more integrated way of delivering the infrastructure, because ultimately this is for the benefit of the communities.
That's great. So basically, how we restructure the funding mechanism. And a discussion was very interesting this morning was also how that could lead to new mechanisms where you do risk in different ways across the process. A bit more similar to what happened with VC when you need to innovate in infrastructure. Can we mimic that model and, in the funding system? But I want to ask João, based on what we just heard, and, do you also see a crisis in public-private partnerships? And what are the key public-private partnerships you're working on in São Paulo?
Carlo, exactly what we are doing in São Paulo, in the city and the state of São Paulo, is partnership with the private sector, working together to work better. We started this when I was mayor of São Paulo, and we continue to do that as governor of São Paulo. 2 weeks ago, we announced the largest highway concession in Brazil, $4 billion project. We included the obligation to have carbon neutral in this concession to work together with the private constructors of this highway. And many other projects that we are doing, preparing, planning right now in São Paulo state. We consider the climate change and also the protection of the environment. So we still go on this way, working together, very close to the private sector and the private investors.
Great. Now, when we look at all of this, going back to engineering, you started with data, and data is a key component of this. I want to open this to all of you. How do you see that changing really the way we tackle some of the challenges that were just outlined? Could data be a game changer in some of these issues?
Carla, can I just pick up on two of the points that Christian and Marie had brought up? First of all, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the inequality question. One of the challenges, I think, with introducing digital technology and some of the advances that I mentioned in my opener is that we don't want them to exacerbate even more this digital divide. And so I think that that's a major concern that hopefully we can address as part of our respective agendas. And then I think, Marie, your comment on the need for financing is absolutely critical. I was in a session yesterday about cities being able to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals, and there were representatives from Cisco, for example, that's done a lot of work on smart cities, and what some of those representatives were saying is the technology has existed, and the tech companies have already disrupted, they've already been innovating, it's ready to go, but the real gap is exactly as you mentioned, is that there's not financing for cities to actually take advantage and adopt some of these technologies and implement them. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add to those comments.
Can I just pick up on the data piece? I mean, what data creates is transparency. And transparency allows us to kind of draw conclusions, what is the best use of that money where we are short of. But going back to that private and public partnership, I think the biggest issue around that topic is the different speed to action. And there are good reasons for it, but businesses have to kind of deploy their capital in a very efficient way, and so speed is very important. And when we see big infrastructure developments where you want to create a new kind of center for business or a new area for residential, the buildings are all finished, the offices are open, and then they are still digging the 5G in, and the underground stations is going to open up 6 years later. And so that disconnect is something which is really making public and private partnerships quite difficult. If you were to move it much more to the private side, and the public side is only there to kind of create the legal framework and the governance, you often come into kind of political issues, because there's a lot of kind of different political views around it, and the average term for politicians, and I'm generalizing here, tends to be around 4 years. Big infrastructure projects tend to be 10 years. So you may face completely different political opinions while you're doing your big infrastructure project.
It's great, Christian. But,
just to add that I agree 100% with Christian on these remarks. It's the same situation in Africa, in Europe, in South America, anywhere. So I agree 100% with you.
But now, and Marie, on this, however, your point about the crisis of PPPs was more on the fact, it seemed to me that you were saying that some of the issues were also from the private sector side. So how do you see this? Is really all the blame on the governments, or is it on the private sector?
No, I think it's obviously back to the point that I mentioned. It has to be much more collaborative. And again, on the risk, what we see very often, at least in emerging markets, is that the attraction on PPP is that, look, my balance sheet is actually quite constrained. I need a bit of innovation, but more importantly, some financing. And then, and I would like to be able to outsource completely this project. And I would like to be able to shift most of the risk to the private sector. So very often, a lot of the work that we do with countries is trying to educate them that, you need to build trust between the public and the private sector, and understanding that as a public sector, as a government, you need to demonstrate your ability to implement a couple of projects that you keep on balance sheet, that you basically show good operation and maintenance, that you have the right institution, also regulatory frameworks and that type of thing. And then, only then, you will give the kind of confidence that the private sector will say, okay, in that case, we have a trusted partner. But then this early consultation are quite critical. I mean, we work in a couple of countries where we had, with the governments, they were, look, we have a problem with this program. We've been launching it. And for an example, in ports, for example, for one country, and they say, we have no response from the private sector. So we say, well, we're going to facilitate those discussions to ensure that eventually, if any of your policies should be adjusted, or maybe the private sector has some question, they have a neutral platform to actually discuss these issues.
And could data on that platform help to increase transparency, trust between the parties, and also measurable KPIs? Yeah, but data is key. I completely agree with Christian. I mean, first of all, when you're an investor and then you look at the alternative asset side of things, you need, obviously, you compete with other part of your portfolio and other assets that are much more known. So the first bit is actually trying to show that really infrastructure is good money, is good investment for patient capital, and that's challenge still, because I think the more recent research on EDIC Infra has shown that the IRR on equity is 7% currently on infrastructure. So how do you actually challenge this with other type of asset you could invest in? So it's still something to keep in mind. I mean, the very high yield that we used to have in the past is slightly a bit behind us for the time being. And again, having this data is really key to start, showing also to government what the problem is, and then showing to the private sector that at the end, this is a good investment, but in the asset performance-based data could provide them with the confidence that it will provide the yield that they're expecting. So both the political and economic value of data in order to increase transparency and trust. But with this, I really wanted to open it up to the floor. And to all of you, there's a lot of key players from all around the world in this space. So any comments or questions or ideas that you would like to share? Yes. Just 1 second, there's a microphone coming.
Talk loudly. I'm Tony Miller from EAG in Japan. Japan has succeeded in changing from a very troubled environmental situation to a very clean environmental situation from the 60s and 70s to today. My understanding is that only about a quarter of the CO2 emissions are from industry, and that 2/3 of them are from both transportation and electricity generation, for which urban areas are key. But no matter what you do to make urban areas more efficient, you're still generating CO2 emissions in order to get to and from those areas and in order to provide electricity. So it would seem to me that consistent with efforts to reduce emissions caused by cities or related to cities, you're going to need to embrace a carbon tax. Yet no one has talked about a carbon tax today.
More women in leadership, talking about women policies, things will not change, especially infrastructure.
Thank you. And so again, an example of using data, using platform in order again to share information and make our cities more inclusive. Any other thoughts? Yes, Angel.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comments. I would say from the scientific perspective and in the index that I showed at the very last slide, one of the challenges that we face is actually getting that gender disaggregated data so that we can actually reveal these types of insights, understand how women are disproportionately impacted by issues such as violence or climate change, for example. And it's really difficult because many cities across the world don't regularly collect that data, they don't report it, and so it just becomes kind of invisible. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about data as a theme on this panel, and so one of the questions I'd like to also ask the other panelists is, are there other types of data gaps that are preventing implementation of some of the ideas that you mentioned? I mean, Marie talked a lot about risk and being able to identify the appropriate risk to match the PPPs, but I think in my work at least, we're often limited by what data is available, and there's just very little data that picks up on important critical issues like gender.
Yeah, and society at large.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I would comment that we are not lacking data, we are not lacking technology, we are failing on executing. I mean, we have all the technology we need, we have all the data we need, we can look from it from the left and we can look from it from the right, but at the end of the day, we have to execute. And we have an execution problem. We all know what the issues are in the world. And so I think we have to come to an agreement on how can we get better on executing.
And Christian, where would you start for that? You know, what would be your first top 3 actions to better execute?
Well, with regards to infrastructure projects, going back to my earlier point, to overcome that risk of that the political environment is changing, you either have to have an infrastructure project where there is an agreement amongst the major political forces in a city, in a country, on something, so that goes beyond an election term. That is very, very important. Or you have a political environment where there will be no change. You sometimes have that as well. But you need that political clarity that people decide this is what we want to get to over the next 10, 15 years. That is very, very critical. And then I think we have to prioritize really the things we want to achieve. Getting to a sustainable environment is a very, very complex situation, and we just heard, I mean, you can include diversity issues, we can include wealth issues, and there's so many aspects which we can bring into that. And we have to be careful that we're not bringing too much into the topic which we want to solve in one go, because then we may never solve anything, and so we have to prioritize that.
So what would be your top 3 priorities?
Well, at the end of the day, if we want to get something done around an environmental friendly, inclusive environment, you need to have, first of all, public transportation, which is safe, fast, and efficient. Without any public transportation, you will never get to a sustainable environment. We have to include right from the start into the construction a kind of a tech-driven process so that the construction in itself is already sustainable, because a lot of the emissions are being created while you construct a building. And if you construct it the right way, the running of the building, the operations of the building can be super efficient, but that has to be done right at the start. It's very, very expensive to do it afterwards. And so if you just get these 2 things right, you have already 80% what you wanted to achieve.
And actually, the very good thing is, actually, very good news is that some of what was discussed here at Davos over the past couple of days is the fact in all those 3 dimensions. You mentioned transportation, how we make buildings, so the construction sector, and the operations, all of them are also being affected by data, robotization, and AI, and are being radically transformed. You know, we know that making a building, when you see some of the Chinese companies building a building in a week or 2 weeks for 30 stories, that means a new paradigm for doing, which can be more sustainable. So I think it looks like there's a lot of disruption happening here. So your top 3 list could really be a good roadmap moving forward. Any other ideas here from?
Well, Carlo, I just wrote some 4 pillars that we are using in São Paulo State. First, accelerate the modernization of infrastructure. It's so important. Second, invest in technological innovation and digital inclusion. Third, promote equal opportunities and quality services. And fourth, generates new jobs to the poor people.
Great.
We have to care about this point anywhere.
Great. So busy inclusion, but again, sustainability, social and environmental as well. Now, we got just a few minutes left. So the first thing I wanted to ask to everybody, let's say do a final round. Any final ideas? Any concrete next steps you could imagine moving forward? Why don't you start?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think one of the opportunities of being at Davos is having these really rich conversations, and I've been involved in several of them myself, particularly focused on the role of digital technology and helping to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think one of the comments that I've heard a lot from participants in my engagements is, how do we take this conversation forward? How do we actually identify next steps that we can all, after we leave Davos, and implement in our own daily work and our own daily practice? And so, I mean, I think for me, the one action item I hope people would leave this panel with is to not let the conversation stop here, to actually follow up with that person and make those connections, and it's hard. I mean, I think it's really difficult. There's a reason why these types of PPPs don't just materialize out of thin air. I think it's really hard to actually follow through and to reach across sectors and boundaries and connect with people. And so that would be my one action item, is to follow through, and let's not let the conversation stay in this room.
Great. So to be continued.
Yes.
And Chris, your next action item.
Well, I would always hope that we could leave politics a little bit more to the side. Sorry to say that, but I think we all have a good feel of what is right and what is wrong around that topic. And to live in an environment which is kind of made up in a sustainable way, which is inclusive, to have less emissions, this is the right thing. We all know that, and so we can just do that irrespective of politics and people kind of discussing what is the reason for this or what is the reason for that. Just do the right things, and we can do that all by ourselves. We don't need any regulation for that. We don't need anybody to say the world is going down. It just feels better to live that way, and if we take that all home, we can have a massive impact.
Yeah, so remove the political risk so that we can actually implement faster at scale. Marie.
I will certainly make my last point on technology, because I mean, infrastructure has been a very slow to digitalized industry, and so I think now we have a real opportunity to leapfrog how we've been doing infrastructure in the past, because we need infrastructure 4.0 for delivering the economy 4.0 that we are already in. So I think there is hope in there, because and then we are back to infrastructure as a mean and not an end. And so how could we think about the use of technology to help to design and plan for better community-driven infrastructure? So there are a couple of technologies that have emerged recently, like augmented reality, where you have cities that are actually using augmented reality and test this out with lots of different groups. So that could address a lot of the inclusion aspect, and also attention to women, to help the citizens to actually picture what it will look like, and so literally living what their cities will look like, and being able to interact and to provide some feedback. So I think that's really important that we use this technology. And as I mentioned earlier, that the G20 has been looking at that, so we'll be working on this all this year on the infotech agenda. And we are working actually also with the forum on getting additional private sector input to the use cases that the GIH will deliver to the G20 this year on the various technology. Because again, it's not the technology do not exist, but the government should be aware of it, understand what is the value, because technology is usually seen as a cost. So what is the value on the long term, and especially the economic value? And then what are the different policy that should be put in place, or maybe just a few adjustments to this to existing policy to enable technology to help with the future of cities.
Right, so Infrastructure 4.0 will be one of the panels at Davos 2021. And actually, it seems to me it's interesting how fast things have been changing over the past few years. A few years ago, just less than 5 years ago, there was a report by one of the top consulting firms showing the level of digitization in different industries. And construction was at the bottom. It was actually next to farming and hunting. Yes. And things have changed immensely in just 2 or 3 years. João.
Carlo, first of all, congratulations. We are at the same page. It's not normal in a panel when we have 4 people or 5 people telling the same position. And in our case, in São Paulo, Brazil, we insist that we are promoting technology and innovation. That's quite important. Expand equal opportunities. For a part country as Brazil, we have to insist, and we have to make power over equal opportunities. And to finalize, double down on preserving the environment.
João, as well, a great word to summarize and capture actually the discussion today. And then I'd like to invite Catherine to come here on stage for closing remarks.
Thank you, Carlo. Let me just thank each of you for joining us today. I'm Catherine Davison.
Carlo, very good.
Thank you, Alice. I've been asked to, I run cities, infrastructure, and urban services here at the Forum. I've actually been asked to build a new platform around cities, infrastructure, urban services. Carlo, let me thank you for another excellent job moderating this panel. Governor, thank you. Marie, Christian, Angel. The action item for the Forum, Carlo, is precisely this: to develop a platform that allows the acceleration, the amplification, the aggregation of initiatives and efforts that go towards developing sustainable and resilient and inclusive infrastructure in cities. So if you have any questions about that, please come find me. Catherine Davison is my name. And thank you again for hosting, Carlo, as well as for joining the panel
Thank you,
today.
Catherine, and thank you all of you in the room.